Cait Boyer, and today I'm going to be presenting my project, Tackling Tree Inequity, Social and Economic Predictors of Urban Tree Canopy in Tucson, Arizona. So for some context, in 2019, Tucson was the US's third fastest warming city, according to Climate Central, a nonprofit of journalists and climate scientists studying climate change. Tucson's average temperature has risen by 4.48 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970, compared to an average of 1.23 degrees across the contiguous United States. In response, Mayor Regina Romero declared a climate emergency in the city, and several programs were enacted to help mitigate rising temperatures. The largest program that the climate emergency enacted was the Tucson Million Trees Initiative, which intends to plant 1 million trees in the city by 2030. The city recognizes that their tree planting efforts should be focused in disadvantaged areas, but they need to determine what neighborhoods are most vulnerable, and that's where this project originated. I have a strong interest in sustainability and combating climate change, so when Peter Johnson with the city presented about this topic, I asked if I could get involved. So let's talk about the benefits of tree canopy. First, there are the health benefits. They produce cleaner air, they sequester carbon, they encourage exercise, and they reduce surface temperature and the risk of heat stroke. A lot of studies have shown that tree canopy increases mental wellness. For environmental, they decrease flood risk because they are taking up that water. They reduce soil erosion because their roots are hanging onto the soil. They increase groundwater recharge because trees are planted in permeable surfaces, and they reduce chemical input into washes and streams because those chemicals are being sequestered into the trees themselves. For economics, they raise property values. The more trees on a property, the more valuable the home is, and they reduce air conditioning costs because of the cooling effect that trees have. So tree canopy is unfortunately often inequitable, particularly in arid places like Tucson, where irrigation is necessary to establish and maintain those trees. Just to speak to that narrative of inequity, here you can see a map of the poverty percentage in Tucson, and you'll notice this dark red stripe on the west side of town. And when you compare that to the tree canopy, you'll notice that tree canopy is lower in those areas of high poverty. So our problem statement, tree cover in Tucson is inequitably distributed. That lack of tree cover in some neighborhoods leaves residents vulnerable to heat stress and less resilient to the long-term effects of climate change. So our research questions, what social and economic factors predict tree canopy in Tucson? And how can we use those factors to guide tree planting efforts in the future? To answer these questions, we're going to do some regression analysis to see what variables best predict tree cover in Tucson. Once we find those variables, we can extrapolate on that information to determine what causes tree inequity in Tucson. So for our outline, first we're going to start with data, move on to methodology and our results. So for our data, I use the census block group Tigerline data, which you can see here on the left-hand side, and the 2018 American Community Survey, which is socioeconomic variables that the census provides. 26 variables are shown here on the right. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're all variables that are commonly associated with tree cover from previous studies on this topic. They include stuff like race, poverty, income, age variables, as well as physical variables like the median year the structure was built or the number of vacant households. Additionally, I was graciously provided this 2015 tree canopy data by the Pima Association of Governments, aka PAG. This data was produced using high-resolution LiDAR data and the Pima County's land use land cover classification, which was produced by PAG. They do a flyover to collect this data yearly or nearly yearly, and some years we're lucky enough to get this data set because it is very difficult to produce. It's a raster data set, so the area of tree cover was calculated for each census block and then divided by the total area to get percentage tree canopy area. You can see on the left side that it looks like Tucson is absolutely covered in trees, but at a larger scale on the right, you can see that the true footprint of those trees is much smaller. This image was captured over the University of Arizona. So moving on to our methodology. For our study area, I initially limited the area to any census block group that intersected with the Tucson city limits, which is shown in this gray line around the study area. But it became clear that there were some projection issues or just general errors in the data because there's quite a few block groups with just a sliver inside the city limits, particularly here on this northern side and on this just around the borders. There's just a little tiny bit within the city limits. So because the study is focused specifically on the city of Tucson, any block groups with less than 50% of their area within the city limits were removed from the analysis. Additionally, these census block groups down here in the southern part of town contain large swaths of desert land with very low population density. These areas really skewed our statistical analysis. So any census block groups with a population density of less than 200 people per square kilometer were removed from the analysis. So here you can see our final study area in the dark green, and everything that was excluded is in the lighter green in the background. So to determine which social and economic variables predict tree cover, I ran several types of regression analysis. Regression analysis essentially predicts the relationship between a dependent variable and which is in this case tree canopy, and one or more independent variables. In this case, we're using socioeconomic variables. ArcGIS Pro provides three pretty strong regression tools that were used in this analysis. The first was the exploratory regression, second, ordinary least squares regression, and third, geographically weighted regression. So the first tool in our toolkit is exploratory regression. This tool evaluates a set of explanatory variables that you provide and creates a set of models that best explain the dependent variable. This tool is valuable in determining which explanatory variables best explain your dependent variable and helps to create a best fit model for further analysis. Using that best fit model that we determined from the exploratory regression, we ran an ordinary least squares regression. This tool provides a global model with a single equation that creates predictions for the entire study area. It produces several diagnostic results. The R squared tells us how well the model predicts the dependent variable. The closer to 1, the better. The AICC, which is used to compare the quality of the different models, the lower the better. However, anything less than a 3-point difference between those AICCs is not statistically significant. The Canker statistic, which will tell us whether or not the relationships between the variables are non-stationary, and the Yarke-Bera statistic, which will show us the model's whether the model's residuals are normally distributed, which we want. And finally, that model will produce coefficients, which will tell us more about the relationship between the explanatory variables and the dependent variables. And then finally, we will be running a geographically weighted regression, which is a local model. An equation is produced for every polygon, and it accounts for the neighborhood. It better accounts for spatial autocorrelation, and the parameters I used are shown here on the screen. For this project, I ran 2 rounds of exploratory regression. For the first round, I used ArcGIS Pro's Enrich tool to enrich the census block groups with all 26 of those variables shown on that last slide. Enrich uses census data to estimate socioeconomic variables for the current year. And this first round of exploratory regression was just to narrow down those 26 variables to just 12. I used Enrich because it's far easier to use than obtaining raw census data. For all those variables. So this round of exploratory regression on the Enrich tool gave me 12 variables that I obtained directly from the 2018 American Community Survey. Using those 12 variables, another round of exploratory regression was run, and the best model from this exploratory regression was used in the OLS and GWR analyses. So moving on to our results. So here you can see the results of our exploratory regression on the Enrich tool estimates. These top 4 models are shown here. These models only contain 12 unique variables that were used that moved on into the ACS, the raw ACS estimates, that version of the exploratory regression, and those 12 variables are shown here on the right. Now for the results of the raw 2018 ACS exploratory regression, we can see that these top 4 models are pretty close to each other. Every one has the exact same R squared value, and the AIC only varies about two points, which means that these are not statistically better than one another. However, we just ended up using the top model, which has the lowest AICC. So let's move on to the results of the OLS regression. Plugging those 8 variables that we determined from that exploratory analysis, we can see a comparison between the OLS model's predictions and actual tree canopy. So on the left-hand side, we have the projections from that model. And on the right-hand side, we have actual tree canopy. The variables that were used in this model were population density, the percentage people with a bachelor's degree, median household income, the percentage of rental units, percent white population, percent people living alone, vacant households, and the median age of the structure. As you can see, there's some areas where the model does a decent job of predicting tree canopy and areas where it doesn't. For example, down here in the center of town, where there's a lot of tree cover, the model doesn't necessarily predict that very well. So moving on to the diagnostics from that OLS regression, the adjusted R-squared is just 0.46, which means 46% of tree canopy is being explained by this model, and that's not great. We will see improvement with the GWR model, though. So that's the R-squared. And then the second thing I want to point out is the canker statistic, which is statistically significant, which means that our relationships are non-stationary and we have to trust our robust probabilities. Additionally, the Yarke-Barrett statistic is significant, which indicates that the model's residuals are not normally distributed. And the results of the Moran's I test shown here indicate the same thing, that the residuals are clustered. The z-score is 15, which indicates that the clustered pattern is not a result of random chance, and our model shows spatial autocorrelation. For these reasons, we consider the model biased, and a big reason for that is that we are missing a key explanatory variable. So here we can see some of the stats of the different variables. Note that all of these probabilities are statistically significant, and all of the VIF scores are less than 7.5. That VIF score indicates multicollinearity, and in this case, we have surprisingly low multicollinearity. As for the coefficients, there are some expected results and some unexpected ones. For population density, we see a positive coefficient, and that makes sense because you would think that the more people you have, the more trees you have. Median household income and white population are also expected results with a positive correlation, as we've seen in multiple other studies that income and white population are generally positively correlated with tree cover. One of the unexpected ones is rentals. My prediction was that the more rental properties, less trees, because tenants don't necessarily have to take care of their trees, etc. But that was a surprising result. So moving on to the results of our graphically weighted regression. Here you can see a comparison of the OLS results versus the GWR results. The R-squared of the OLS was 0.39. This is a different one that I'm not going to get into, but it's just 0.39 or 0.38 for the adjusted R-squared and 0.66 for the adjusted R-squared of the GWR, which is almost double what the OLS was, which means that that local model produced by the graphically weighted regression was much better. Also, the AICC dropped by nearly 100 or over 150 points. So we can see a comparison of these predictions. On the left-hand side, we have the OLS results, and this is the predicted tree cover. And on the right, we see the GWR. We can get more into this in detail on the next slide. So here we have a graphic showing the difference between the predicted and actual canopy. So the GWR prediction is on the left-hand side, and the ordinary least squares on the right-hand side. The closer to zero, the better here, because it is a difference between the actual and the predicted. So any areas that are light pastel yellow are better. That means that the model predicted within 1 percentage point of the actual tree canopy. And just visually from this, you can tell that the GWR did a lot better job at predicting than the ordinary least squared. Those red areas indicate where the model underestimated tree canopy, and blue areas are where it overestimated tree canopy. So in conclusion, we found that these 7 variables predict tree cover in Tucson. I'm going to be presenting these results to the city of Tucson with a recommendation to the Tucson Million Trees Initiative. I would like them to take into the consideration these various variables into consideration when they're deciding where to prioritize tree planting efforts. This study has shown that these variables are what makes a person vulnerable to tree inequity and Tucson's unique climate and socioeconomic makeup. For future considerations, I would reanalyze on more current data The tree canopy data I used was from 2015, which is pretty old, and the census data was from 2018. I've heard that the current census data is maybe not reliable, but rerunning this analysis on more current data is a good idea. And engaging with the Tucson Million Trees initiative about incorporating this study into their efforts. And finally, rerunning this analysis as tree planting ramps up to make sure that tree planting efforts are focused on increasing tree equity in Tucson. Thank you so much. I will take questions now.